The marketplace was bustling with energy, the noise of people happening filled the air, the scents of spices and cooked food, mixed with the faint smell of metal from the nearby docks. And though there was life all around her, the small alien girl felt invisible. She had learned long ago that her presence was unwanted. Her kind, the Zelari, were known for their strength, their speed, but not for their hearts, not for their capacity to feel, to care. She was no more than a stray, a thing to be ignored, a thing to be avoided. She walked slowly through the crowd, her green-tinted skin blending with the shadows, her large eyes searching for any sign of kindness. But there was none. She pulled her ragged cloak tighter around her thin frame, the hunger gnawing at her insides. Her stomach growled loudly, but she had learned to ignore the sound long ago. She moved toward a food stall, hoping for scraps left behind by careless buyers. The stall owner, a tall man with a sharp gaze, spotted her approach and immediately shooed her away. His voice was loud and dismissive. "Don't touch anything," he warned, and she obeyed instinctively, retreating back into the alleyways that bordered the marketplace. She crouched low against the wall of a building, the shadows providing some comfort. She could smell the food from the stall. It was fresh, it would taste good. But it was out of reach, so she waited patiently, like she always did, for the moment when the world would forget she was there, and the food would be left unattended, just long enough for her to steal a piece, to quiet the hunger for a few minutes. It never lasted longer than that, and the cycle would repeat. The girl had learned survival in a cruel world. She had no name, no family, no home. Her memories were fragments, distant flashes of a life that once was her parents, her people, their voices, the warmth of a place she no longer knew. They were all lost now, leaving her to wander from planet to planet in search of something she couldn't even name. Her eyes shifted nervously to the bustling crowd. They were all too busy to notice her. They never saw her unless they needed her, something to toss aside. Once they were done, she was a nobody, and nothing. She thought about leaving the city, maybe finding another planet where she might have better luck. But she knew better than to hope for kindness in a universe like this. Kindness was a rare thing, a fleeting thing, a thing that could break you if you relied on it too much. So she remained here in the shadows, invisible to the world. Her eyes followed a group of humans walking by, their laughter light and carefree. She wondered what it would be like to be one of them, to belong somewhere, to be loved for just existing. But those thoughts were useless. She wasn't human, she was different. No one cared for the different ones, the strange ones, the ones who didn't belong. So she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of their laughter wash over her, before turning her attention back to the food stall. She had to wait, but her patience was growing thin. The hunger was unbearable. Her hands clenched into fists. She couldn't wait any longer. But just as she began to rise, a soft voice interrupted the moment. She froze, her heart skipped a beat. Who would speak to her in this place? No one ever did. She looked up and saw an old man standing before her, his face weathered by time, his eyes soft with kindness. He looked down at her, his hand holding something wrapped in paper. She didn't speak. She didn't know how to. She hadn't spoken to anyone in so long that words felt foreign to her. But the man smiled gently, as if he had seen her before, as if he knew her. He offered her the food without a word. Her eyes flicked to the food and then back to his face. Was this real? Was this kindness a trick of her mind? Was he really offering her something, or was she dreaming? But he didn't move. He stood there, patiently waiting for her to take it. She stared at the food, her hands shaking. The hunger was overpowering. But so was the fear. She had never been given anything without a price. Nothing came without a cost. But this man's presence made her hesitate. He didn't seem to expect anything from her, nothing at all. His eyes just held a quiet patience, a calm understanding. She reached out, slowly, trembling fingers brushing against his weathered hand before she took the food, and without a second thought devoured it, as if it were the only thing that mattered. The old man watched as the girl ate, her hands shaking slightly with each bite. He saw the desperation in her actions, the way she devoured the food, as if it might disappear at any moment. He didn't move, not even when she finished, and looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. She was still the same small, fragile girl who had walked into the marketplace an hour ago. But now there was something different in her eyes, something that wasn't there before, a flicker of hope that he hadn't expected. He knew he couldn't just walk away. Not after seeing that look in her eyes. He had seen enough of the world to understand the weight of desperation, And the cost of turning away from someone in need, it wasn't just about giving her food, it was about something deeper, something that only people who had seen too much could understand. He offered a warm smile, no words, just a gesture of kindness. He knew she was afraid, maybe not of him, but of everything else. The world she had lived in had made her wary of kindness. She had learned that nothing came for free, and that trust was a luxury few could afford. But he couldn't let her face the world alone, not if there was something he could do about it. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice gentle, quiet, as if he were testing the waters. "You don't have to be alone, you know," he said, his words careful, each one chosen with care. "I don't know where you came from or why you're here, but if you're willing, I can offer you a place to stay for a while. No strings attached, just safety. And a meal when you need it." The girl stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, she didn't move, just stood there looking at him, as if she couldn't comprehend what he was offering. It was clear she had lived too long in a world that didn't give anything without expecting something in return. She had no reason to believe his words, but he meant them all the same. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He wasn't offering a trade. He was offering something as rare as hope, something that could change everything for her. The silence stretched between them longer than he had hoped. But then slowly the girl nodded, not with complete certainty, but with something softer, a flicker of trust, just enough to make the difference. He nodded back gently and offered her a hand. "Come with me," he said softly. "Let me help you get out of here." And for the first time in a long while, the girl didn't feel the need to run or hide. She didn't feel the cold presence of fear wrapping around her chest. She only felt the faintest glimmer of something she hadn't known in so long, the sense of a possibility, not the certainty of danger, but the possibility of safety. So she followed him, not knowing what would happen next, but trusting in the moment, trusting in something she had long since given up hope on. She followed him through the marketplace, past the other people who didn't notice her and didn't care. They never would. She was used to that. She had learned to blend into the background, to become a shadow, a part of the world that no one cared to see. But with every step she took behind him, she felt herself lifting from that shadow for the first time in years. She felt the weight of her past, and her isolation begin to fade with each step. She felt a little lighter, a little less afraid. He led her through a quiet alleyway to a small building tucked between two larger structures. It wasn't much, a humble place compared to the grand shops and bustling markets, but it was hers for as long as she needed it. And in that moment it felt like the world had shifted just enough to offer her a chance she hadn't known she had been waiting for. The door creaked open as the old man led her inside. The warmth of the small room hit her like a wave. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be inside, somewhere safe, somewhere not filled with the cold and hunger of the streets. She stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do next, her hands still clutching the last of the food she had eaten, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. The walls were simple, painted in faded colors, but there was a small fire burning in the corner, casting a soft orange glow over the room. A small table with chairs sat against one wall, and a narrow bed was tucked into the corner. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what she was supposed to do now. She had never stayed in one place for long, never trusted anyone for too long, but this time felt different. She could feel the warmth of the fire on her skin, and for the first time in a long while she felt something resembling comfort. The old man smiled kindly and motioned for her to sit at the table. "I'm Harrison," he said softly, "and you are welcome here. You can rest here as long as you need." The girl still didn't speak, her throat tight with emotions she had never allowed herself to feel. She nodded slowly and moved to the table, sitting down awkwardly, unsure of how to act in such a place. She had forgotten how to be a child, forgotten what it felt like to feel safe, to feel at ease. Everything had been about survival for so long. There had been no time for anything else, no time for joy, no time for trust. She sat quietly watching Harrison as he moved around the room, his movements slow and deliberate. As if he didn't want to startle her, he went to a small cupboard and pulled out a pot, setting it over the fire to heat some water for tea. When he turned back to her, she was still sitting there, her eyes wide, like she was waiting for something to happen, like she was waiting for the trap to be sprung. The catch in his kindness, he could see it in her eyes, the way she was waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart. But Harrison didn't move to disappoint her. He didn't rush or push. He simply kept his movements calm and steady, waiting for her to come to him in her own time. He didn't need to force trust. He didn't need to make her believe in the safety of the room. He just needed her to know it was hers to claim. If she wanted it, the silence stretched between them. But it was a different kind of silence, not the uncomfortable one filled with tension, but a quiet one filled with the possibility of peace. After what felt like an eternity, the girl finally spoke, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. "I don't know your name," she said, her words hesitant, unsure. Harrison smiled warmly as he poured the tea into 2 mugs. "I'm Harrison," he said again. "I've already told you that. But I'm also a stranger in a way, just like you. I'm here to help you, to offer you a place to stay if you want it. You don't need to explain anything to me. You don't need to tell me where you came from or why you're alone. Just know that you are welcome here." The girl looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. She had no idea what to make of him. There was nothing in his eyes that said he wanted anything from her, nothing that hinted at a hidden agenda. She had learned to read people quickly, to know when someone was lying or pretending to be kind. But with Harrison, there was none of that. His eyes were warm, steady, and genuine. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. Maybe there was kindness left in the world. She nodded slightly, still unsure, but something inside her told her it was okay. It was okay to let her guard down just a little bit. Harrison set a mug in front of her and smiled gently. "Drink the tea. It will help you sleep. You must be exhausted after everything." She took the mug, slowly holding it in her hands, the warmth of it spreading through her fingers. As she brought it to her lips, the steam rising into the air, smelling faintly of herbs and spices, she took a sip and felt a small sense of comfort wash over her. The taste was unfamiliar but soothing. And for the first time in a long while, she let herself close her eyes and just breathe, letting the safety of the room surround her for the moment. She was allowed to be more than just a survivor. She was allowed to be a person, someone with a future not defined by hunger or pain, but by the quiet hope that maybe things could get better. Maybe she could learn to live again. The days passed slowly. At first, the girl, whose name Harrison learned was Kira, began to adjust to the rhythm of the small home. Each day was marked by the quiet sounds of the morning birds singing outside and the scent of cooking that filled the air. Harrison would wake early and begin his work in the shop, and Kira would watch from the doorway. At first, she didn't move much. She would sit in the corner by the fire or stand by the window, looking out at the world she had once known, but now felt so far removed from. She didn't know what to do with herself. She didn't know how to be here in this place of peace. It felt unnatural to her. After all the years spent on the run from place to place, trying to survive, trying to make it through each day without being noticed or pushed aside, now there was no need for that. She didn't have to hide anymore. She didn't have to fear what would happen next, but old habits were hard to break. And she found herself watching the door, watching Harrison's every move, as if she expected something to go wrong. She would flinch whenever someone knocked on the door, or when she heard footsteps approaching outside. Her hand would instinctively reach for something nearby, even if it was just a tool or a piece of metal, ready to defend herself, ready for the world to hurt her again. But Harrison noticed, and he never said anything. He just kept going about his work, letting her come to him. When she was ready, letting her find her own way in the quiet of his home. She watched him work on machines, fixing broken things. She had never seen such things before, but she was fascinated by it. All the way he used his hands to make things whole again, the way he could take something that was broken and make it new. She watched him with a mixture of awe and curiosity, asking questions now. And then, as she began to understand more about the work he did, she had always been good with her hands, always quick to learn new things. But she had never had the chance to explore her skills to their fullest. She had never been given the freedom to learn without fear of being hunted or driven away. Now that she had the time and the safety to do so, she devoured the knowledge he offered her, eagerly watching and learning as much as she could. But it wasn't just the machines that fascinated her, it was Harrison himself. She had never met anyone like him, no one who treated her like she mattered, no one who saw her as something more than just a lost child, a thing to be cast aside. She had spent so much of her life in isolation that she didn't know how to respond to kindness. It was a foreign concept to her, something so rare she had come to believe it was a myth. But Harrison wasn't a myth, he was real. And he treated her like she was too. Even on days when she didn't feel worthy of his kindness, he never wavered in his care for her. He always had a gentle word or a soft smile or an encouraging look. When she was struggling with something new, it was almost too much to accept. But she tried to allow herself to feel it, tried to let herself believe that maybe this wasn't a dream, maybe she wasn't going to wake up and find herself back in the cold streets, fighting for survival once again. One day Harrison took a break from his work and sat down next to her, his expression thoughtful. As he looked at the small pile of parts she had been working on, he nodded approvingly at her progress and smiled. "You've got a real talent for this," he said, his voice soft but filled with pride. "You've got an eye for details I've never seen in anyone else. You could go far if you kept at it." His words hit her like a wave. She hadn't expected them. She hadn't been prepared to hear him say something like that. She had always been told she was nothing special, nothing worth caring about. No one had ever looked at her like this. No one had ever taken the time to really see her for what she could be. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to such unexpected praise. So she just looked at him for a long moment, taking in the warmth of his smile and the sincerity in his eyes. It was the first time someone had made her feel like she was more than just a survivor, like she could actually be something she had never dared to dream of before. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to her life than just surviving. Maybe there was a future waiting for her, one that didn't involve constant fear, one that didn't involve running or hiding or always looking over her shoulder. Maybe she could be something more. One afternoon, as Harrison was working on a set of broken tools that had been brought in by a local merchant, he heard a loud crash from the direction of the front door. It was followed by shouting and the sound of boots pounding against the floor. Harrison's first instinct was to grab the nearest object to defend himself, but he froze when he heard the unmistakable voices of two men, one shouting orders and the other grunting in pain. He knew immediately that this wasn't a simple disagreement. This was something more dangerous, something that could change everything. The moment the door slammed open, the two men entered the small shop. One was a burly figure with a thick beard, and the other was shorter, but no less intimidating. They both wore uniforms marked with the insignia of a local mercenary group, known for causing trouble in the area. Their eyes were cold and calculating. They had come for something, and Harrison could tell it wasn't going to be a polite conversation. One of the men spoke first, his voice loud and full of authority. "Where is the girl? The one that's been hiding here?" The words sent a cold chill down Harrison's spine. He didn't need to ask who they meant. He knew exactly who they were talking about. He turned slowly to look at Kira, who was sitting near the fire, her eyes wide with fear. She had no idea who these men were, but she knew enough to recognize that they were a threat. Harrison stood between them and her, not knowing what to expect, but prepared to fight if he had to. The burly man took a step forward, his gaze hardening. "You're sheltering a fugitive," he growled, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "She's an alien, and we have orders to bring her in. You know the law." The words echoed in Harrison's mind. Fugitive, alien. The girl he had taken in without question was being hunted like an animal for the crime of being different, for the crime of existing in a world that didn't want her. The thought made his blood run cold. He didn't know the full extent of her past. He didn't know why they were after her. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let these men take her away. Not without a fight. He clenched his fists, ready for whatever came next. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, Kira moved past him, her small figure standing tall in front of the two men. She didn't look afraid. In fact, she looked almost calm, her eyes steady and full of something that took Harrison by surprise. It wasn't fear, it wasn't desperation. It was defiance. The girl he had once known as timid and fragile had changed over the last few weeks. He had watched her grow stronger, more confident. But this was different. She was standing up for herself in a way he hadn't seen before. It was a raw power, something ancient and deep within her. It was as if the weight of all the pain she had endured had awakened something inside her, something that wouldn't let her be pushed around anymore. She didn't speak at first. She just stood there staring at the men with a look that could have burned through steel. The shorter man scoffed and made a move to grab her arm, But before he could reach her, Kira shifted in a blur of movement. Her foot slammed into his chest with a force that sent him crashing to the ground, his breath knocked out of him. The burly man shouted in surprise and rushed at her, but she was already moving again, her body flowing with grace and speed that Harrison had never seen in anyone. She dodged his attacks with ease, a small frame, making her almost impossible to catch. He was bigger and stronger, but she was faster and smarter. She ducked under his swing and struck his side with a kick that left him stumbling backward, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected her to fight back, and now he was rethinking his approach. The fight was over before it had even begun. The two men were on the ground, groaning in defeat, while Kira stood over them, her chest rising and falling with each breath, her eyes still glowing with that same defiant fire. Harrison watched in awe at what he had just witnessed. The girl he had taken in out of compassion had transformed into something else, someone who wouldn't back down from anyone, someone who had the strength to protect herself and those she cared about without hesitation. The burly man groaned and slowly started to rise up from the floor. He looked at Kira with newfound respect and fear. What had he asked, his voice shaky for the first time, his confidence faltering? Kira didn't answer him. Instead, she stepped closer to Harrison, her gaze softening for just a moment before she looked back at the men and pointed to the door. "Get out," she said, her voice steady, calm, and final. The two men didn't hesitate. They scrambled to their feet and bolted out of the door as quickly as they had come, leaving only the silence of the room behind them. Harrison was speechless. He had no words for what he had just witnessed. All he could do was stare at Kira, who was now standing tall in front of him. A girl who had once been nothing more than a frightened orphan had become something more, something that he didn't fully understand, but something he knew he would never forget. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Harrison stood there, stunned, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Kira hadn't just defended herself, she had taken control of the situation in a way that was beyond anything he had expected. He knew she was strong, he had seen glimpses of her resilience, but this was something else entirely. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a fighter. And he couldn't help but wonder how much more she was capable of, how much of her past had shaped her into this person. Standing before him, her eyes met his. Then she looked away quickly, as if embarrassed by the attention she had just drawn to herself. But Harrison could see the exhaustion in her features. He could see the toll that the fight had taken on her, even if she wasn't showing it outwardly. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, less surprised, more concerned. She nodded slowly, still not meeting his gaze. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady, but there was a hint of wariness in it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. But Harrison knew better than to push her. She had her walls, and he had learned not to break them down. All at once he gave her a small nod and turned back to the door. He locked it behind him and then checked the window, making sure no one else was lurking nearby before he turned back to her and spoke again. "That was incredible," he said, his words filled with awe. "You're faster than anyone I've ever seen. It was like you knew exactly what they were going to do before they did it." Kira shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "I had to learn how to survive," she said quietly. "It wasn't always like this. When I was younger, I was scared, I couldn't defend myself. But over time, I had to learn to protect myself. I had to learn to fight if I wanted to stay alive." The words hit Harrison like a blow to the chest. He had known she had been through something difficult, but he hadn't realized just how much she had been forced to endure. She had grown up in a world that had never shown her kindness or safety, a world that had demanded she fight to survive. And now here she was in his home, in a place where she didn't have to fight anymore. And yet, it seemed that the battle inside her was far from over. He walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder, gently trying to offer some kind of reassurance. But even as he did, he knew that this wasn't something he could fix. It wasn't something anyone could fix. No one could undo the years of hardship she had faced. But he could offer her a place where she didn't have to fight anymore, a place where she could let her guard down, if only for a little while. He could offer her the safety she had never known. He'd offer her the peace she deserved. The thought brought a sense of warmth to his chest as he realized just how much he wanted that for her. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said softly, his voice sincere. "You don't have to fight for your survival anymore. Not here, not with me. I'll keep you safe, I promise." Kira looked up at him, finally meeting his gaze, her eyes still guarded, but there was something softer in them now, something that wasn't there before. She didn't speak at first, but after a long moment, she gave him a small nod. Maybe she wasn't ready to fully trust him yet. Maybe she wasn't ready to let go of the years of fear and uncertainty that had shaped her, but she was willing to try, and that was enough for him. For now, that was all he needed to know. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Harrison allowed himself to relax just a little bit. The tension that had been coiled tight in his chest slowly began to loosen as he looked at the girl before him. She wasn't just some orphan anymore. She wasn't just some lost soul. She was a person. She was someone with strength and courage. And she deserved more than the world had ever given her. She deserved peace. She deserved to live without fear. And he would do whatever it took to make sure she had that. Slowly, Harrison moved back to the table and sat down, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He had to think about what came next. He had to figure out how to keep her safe from whatever dangers still lurked out there. But for now, all he could do was let her rest, let her feel safe. And he knew that if she stayed with him long enough, she might begin to believe that it was possible to have a life outside of survival, one where kindness and trust could exist. And that thought gave him a small flicker of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. The days that followed were quieter, but a tension still lingered between them. Harrison could see it in Kira's eyes, the way she would occasionally glance toward the door or the window as if expecting someone to burst in and drag her away. The fear was still there, buried deep inside her, but it was masked by a quiet resolve, a determination to stand her ground, to not let the past define her. But it was clear she hadn't fully let go of the weight she carried. The fear of being hunted still clung to her. No matter how much she tried to push it down, she hadn't spoken much since the incident with the mercenaries. She had returned to her usual silence, withdrawing into herself. When she wasn't learning about the work Harrison did, she would sit by the fire, her eyes distant, as if lost in thought. Sometimes Harrison would try to engage her in conversation, asking her questions about her past or her family, but she would deflect or change the subject. She didn't want to talk about it. And he didn't press. He knew that when she was ready, she would share, when she felt safe enough to trust him with the pieces of her past. But until then, he would wait, and he would give her the space she needed to heal. One evening, as the sun began to set and the soft orange glow of the twilight filled the room, Harrison noticed something different in Kira's posture. She was sitting near the fire as usual, but her body was more relaxed, her shoulders no longer tense, her hands resting lightly on her knees. He watched her for a moment before slowly getting up and walking over to her. He sat down a little distance away, not wanting to startle her or invade her space, but he wanted to be near her in case she needed him. Without a word, he reached over and grabbed a small tool from the table beside them and began working on a broken piece of machinery. She didn't speak at first, but Harrison could feel her eyes on him. He had gotten used to her quiet observance. She didn't say much, but he knew she was always watching, always taking in everything around her. Sometimes he would catch her watching him as he worked, and for a moment he would wonder what she was thinking, what she saw when she looked at him. He had no answers to those questions, but he didn't mind. Not yet. He had learned that not every silence needed to be filled. Sometimes it was enough to just be present together in the quiet. As the evening wore on, the fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows across the room. Harrison finished his work on the machine and set the tools aside. He glanced at Kira once more and saw that she was still watching him, her eyes softer now, as if she were gathering the courage to speak. When she finally did, her voice was low and hesitant. "I used to have a family," she said quietly. "It wasn't always like this. We weren't rich or powerful, but we were together. We had a home and a place to belong." Harrison listened carefully, not wanting to interrupt or make her feel pressured to continue. But she kept talking, her words spilling out in a soft rush that came with a mix of sadness and longing, as if she were trying to remember something that was slipping away with each passing day. "We were happy once," she said. "I had a mother and a father. They loved me, they protected me. But one day they were gone. They were taken from me by people who didn't care about us. They didn't care who we were or where we came from. All they wanted was to get rid of us, to erase us, as if we never existed. I tried to fight, I tried to run, but I was just a kid. I didn't know how to protect myself." The words hung in the air between them, And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of her story settling over them like a heavy blanket. Harrison could see the pain in her eyes, the memories she was trying to relive. And yet he could also see the strength in her, the resilience that had carried her through it all. It wasn't just her survival that made her strong, it was her ability to keep going despite everything that had been taken from her, despite the fear and the loss. Kira was more than just the girl who had been hunted. She was someone who had survived the worst and come out the other side, even if she hadn't yet realized it herself. Harrison knew this was the beginning of something important, the beginning of a journey for both of them. He couldn't undo the past, he couldn't take away the pain she had endured, but he could offer her something she had never had before, a place to heal, a place to be herself, without fear or judgment, without having to constantly fight for her life. And he would give that to her with everything he had. He would show her that she was more than just a survivor. She was worthy of peace and happiness. Even if it took time for her to believe it, even if it took years, he would wait for her to see it too. The days turned into weeks, and slowly the rhythm of their life together began to settle into a kind of peace that neither of them had known for years. Harrison kept to his work with the same steady focus he always had, but now there was a new sense of purpose in everything he did. He wasn't just fixing machines, he was fixing lives, or at least he was trying to. He watched Kira carefully every day, looking for signs that she was starting to heal, looking for any sign that she was beginning to believe that the world around her could be kind, that she could have a future beyond the shadows of her past. She was still distant at times, still lost in her own thoughts. But there were moments when he would catch a glimpse of something different, a brief spark of hope in her eyes, a small smile when she did something well, or a glimmer of pride when she managed to fix something herself. And every time he saw those moments, he knew she was getting stronger. There was a quiet strength in her that had always been there. It was just buried deep beneath the weight of everything she had endured. Sometimes she would talk about her past, but it was always in bits and pieces, never a complete story. She had learned to keep parts of herself hidden away, and Harrison respected that he never pressed her to talk about things she wasn't ready to share. But he could tell that the more time she spent in his home, the more she allowed herself to let go of the walls she had built up around her. And one evening, as they sat together by the fire, Harrison finally saw something that told him she was beginning to understand, that she wasn't alone anymore. Kira was sitting with her back to the fire, working on a small piece of broken machinery. When she looked up and met his gaze for a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a softness that hadn't been there before. She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words, but then she spoke quietly. "I don't know what comes next," she said, her voice unsure, but there was a quiet strength in it too. "I've been running my whole life, and I don't know how to stop, how to trust that things can be different. But I want to try to let go of the fear. I want to see what life can be like when I don't have to hide anymore." The words hit Harrison harder than he expected, because he realized just how much of a victory this was. She had finally allowed herself to acknowledge the fear she had been living with for so long. She had finally admitted that she wanted something more than survival. And for the first time, Harrison felt a sense of hope stir within him. It wasn't a grand promise, it wasn't a sudden change, but it was enough. It was enough for him to know that she was beginning to believe in the possibility of a future beyond her past. He smiled softly and nodded. "Of course," he said gently, "you don't have to know exactly what comes next, nobody does, but I'll be here, and I'll help you take it one step at a time. We'll figure it out together." And that's enough for now. Kira didn't respond right away, but he saw her shoulders relax just a little. Her hand still held the small tool she had been working with, but she wasn't gripping it tightly anymore. She was holding it more lightly, almost as if she had let go of some of the tension that had been in her for so long. He didn't know if she believed him completely, if she truly felt ready to stop running. But he knew this was the beginning of something new for her. This was the start of a life where she could begin to heal, where she could choose not to live in fear. And maybe one day when she was ready, she would finally believe that she was worthy of peace, worthy of a life without fear. It was a long road ahead, but Harrison knew they were on it together. And that was enough for him. Kira stood up after a moment and walked to the window, looking out into the evening sky. The stars were just starting to appear, and she stared at them for a while as if searching for something. Harrison watched her from where he sat, unsure of what was going through her mind. But he didn't need to ask. He knew that the stars were the same stars she had looked at for years, the same stars she had seen when she was alone and afraid. But tonight something was different. The stars didn't look the same anymore tonight. They felt like a promise, a reminder that no matter how dark things had been, there was always a way forward, and maybe, just maybe, Kira was finally beginning to believe that too. The weeks turned into months, and life at Harrison's home began to take on a rhythm that felt more like normal than either of them could have imagined in the beginning. It wasn't perfect. There were still quiet moments of doubt, still flashes of fear that would cross Kira's face when she heard a distant noise or saw someone passing by. But they were fewer now, and more often than not, Kira found herself smiling. As she worked alongside Harrison, she began to take pride in the things she fixed, the things she created. There was a spark of joy in her that hadn't been there before, when Harrison couldn't help but feel proud of how far she had come. He had seen the transformation in her, how she had gone from a broken girl who was constantly looking over her shoulder to someone who was learning to stand tall, learning to trust, learning to believe in herself. But there was still a part of her that held back, still a part of her that was scared of what might happen if she fully let go of the past and embraced the future. Harrison didn't push her on this. He knew that healing took time, and that sometimes it was a step forward and 2 steps back. But he was patient, and he was there for her every step of the way. One evening, as they sat in the small living room after dinner, Harrison glanced at Kira, who had been unusually quiet for the past hour. She was staring at the floor, her fingers fiddling with a small piece of metal, and Harrison could tell something was on her mind. He had learned to read her over time, and when she was troubled, it showed in the way her shoulders hunched and her eyes avoided his. He set his cup down gently and leaned forward. Kira, he said softly, "You've been quiet tonight. Is something bothering you?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before she looked away. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened to me and what it all means. And I'm scared." Harrison waited patiently, letting her find the words she needed to say. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she continued. "But I'm scared that if I stop being afraid, I'll lose what makes me strong. I've spent so much in my life running and hiding and surviving that I don't know how to be anything else." She paused for a moment and then looked directly at him, her eyes filled with vulnerability. "You've shown me a different way of living, Harrison. You've given me a place to heal. But I'm scared that if I stop being afraid, I'll forget how to protect myself, how to fight back if I need to." Harrison listened carefully to her words, understanding the depth of her fear. Even if he didn't share it himself, he knew that her past had been shaped by survival, that fear had been her armor for so long, and letting go of that armor was terrifying. It meant letting go of everything she had relied on to keep herself safe. But he also knew that there was a different kind of strength in trusting others, in letting yourself be vulnerable, and he knew that she had the strength to find that too. He stood up slowly and walked over to where she sat. He crouched down beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. "I can't tell you not to be afraid," he said softly, "because fear is natural. It's something that's always going to be there. But I can tell you that you don't have to face it alone anymore. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders by yourself. And you don't have to let fear control you anymore. There's another way. You can still be strong without living in constant fear. You can still fight for yourself. But you don't have to do it by constantly running or hiding from what's around you." Kira looked at him, her eyes soft and filled with uncertainty. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope, a glimmer of belief that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. She took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "I want to try," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "I want to learn how to be strong without being afraid all the time." Harrison smiled and squeezed her hand gently. "I believe in you, Kira," he said, with all the sincerity in his heart. "I believe you have more strength inside you than you realize, and I'm here to help you find it." And with that simple promise, something shifted between them. It wasn't an instant change, but it was a beginning of a new kind of strength, the kind that comes from trust, the kind that comes from knowing you don't have to fight alone, the kind that comes from believing in yourself and in the people around you. The days that followed were filled with small victories as Kira slowly learned to let go of the constant fear that had once ruled her life. She still had moments of doubt, still had moments of hesitation, But now she had the tools to face them, and the support of someone who cared about her and who believed in her. Slowly, she began to see a future for herself, a future where she wasn't just a survivor, but a person who could live without fear. And in that future, there was no more running, no more hiding, just the freedom to be whoever she wanted to be, to live without looking over her shoulder. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hope. And that hope was the strongest weapon she had ever had.